Most people don't lose themselves all at once. It happens quietly. You wake up tired, reach for your phone before your mind is even fully awake. And within 30 seconds, your peace already belongs to something else. A message changes your mood, a headline tightens your chest. Someone else's success makes you question your own life before you even left the bed. And the strange part is this: nothing catastrophic has actually happened. The room is still quiet, the morning is still there, but internally you are already being pulled in 10 different directions. Marcus Aurelius understood this battle better than most people realize, not because he lived in peace, but because he lived surrounded by pressure, uncertainty, politics, betrayal, illness, conflict, and responsibility beyond what most of us can imagine. And yet, in the middle of all that noise, he kept returning to one brutal truth: a man's life is shaped less by what happens to him and more by what gains authority inside his mind. That is the real war, not between you and the world, between your automatic self and your conscious self, between impulse and judgment, between reaction and command. Most people think mental strength means becoming hard. Stoicism never taught that. Real mental strength is quieter than that. It is the ability to remain clear when everything around you invites confusion, to stay steady without becoming cold, to feel emotion without becoming owned by it, to walk into difficulty without collapsing into drama. And if we be honest, many people today are exhausted, not because life is impossible, but because their attention is constantly being kidnapped. Every notification becomes an emotional event. Every inconvenience becomes a personal attack. Every delay feels unbearable. Every uncomfortable feeling sends them searching for distraction. And slowly, without realizing it, they lose the ability to sit with themselves in silence. That is why these lessons from Marcus Aurelius still matter. Not because they belong to ancient history, but because the human mind has not changed nearly as much as technology has. The same fear, the same ego, the same anger, the same hunger for approval, the same tendency to escape discomfort instead of understanding it. This video is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming harder to destabilize, because calm is not something you find. It is something you train. And over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 13 Stoic lessons that can fundamentally change the way you respond to pressure, disrespect, distraction, anger, uncertainty, and your own destructive habits. Not with empty motivation, not with recycled slogans, but with practical ways to reclaim authority over your own mind. And if somewhere inside this opening, you recognize your own pattern, the constant tension, the overreaction, the exhaustion of carrying a mind that never truly rests, leave a like on this video. Not as a favor to the channel, as a quiet decision, a marker that today, at least for a little while, you are willing to look honestly at the patterns that have been controlling your life. Because the first lesson Marcus Aurelius would force us to confront is uncomfortable. Most of your suffering is not coming from the event itself. It is coming from the agreement your mind makes with the event. And once you understand that, you stop handing your peace to every passing moment. A man receives a short message from his boss. "We need to talk tomorrow." That's it, no insult, no accusation, no disaster, just 6 words on a screen, but within minutes his body changes, his chest tightens, his thoughts begin inventing outcomes. He replays old mistakes, he imagines losing respect, losing stability, losing control. By nighttime, he is suffering from a future that does not even exist yet. This is one of the first things Marcus Aurelius tried to understand inside himself. The event is one thing. The story we attach to it is another. Most people fuse those together so quickly they cannot tell the difference anymore. Someone ignores them, and they instantly translate it into rejection. A delay becomes disrespect. Criticism becomes humiliation. Failure becomes identity. But Stoicism asks a different question. What actually happened before your interpretation touched it? That question alone can interrupt enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering. Because the mind has a habit of signing emotional contracts too quickly, something happens, and instantly we agree. This ruins my day. This proves I am failing. This means they don't value me. This should not be happening. And once the agreement is signed internally, emotion follows. Marcus Aurelius practiced separating reality from interpretation because he knew that without that separation, the mind becomes easy to manipulate, not only by people, but by circumstances. A calm person is not someone who never feels emotion. A calm person is someone who delays judgment long enough to see clearly. Here's a practical exercise you can use today. The next time something disturbs you, divide it into 3 parts. First, the raw fact. What literally happened, not your interpretation, not your fear, just the observable event. Second, your story about it. What meaning are you attaching to it? Third, your response. What action would still make you respect yourself tomorrow? This sounds simple, but most people never do it. They live fused to their reactions. And when you live that way, your emotional state becomes completely dependent on external movement. One comment can destroy your focus. One inconvenience can poison an entire evening. One person's mood can become your mental weather. Marcus Aurelius understood something deeper. If you do not govern interpretation, you surrender your inner life to randomness. And this is where the first real shift begins. Not by controlling the world, but by refusing to immediately obey every conclusion your mind produces under stress. Because sometimes the most dangerous sentence in your life is not spoken by another person. It is the sentence you instantly tell yourself about what something means. And the next lesson becomes even more important once you realize this. Just because a thought appears inside your mind does not mean it deserves your loyalty. One of the most damaging lies people believe is this: if I had a bad thought, it means I am a bad person. Marcus Aurelius would disagree. A jealous thought appears. An angry impulse rises. You imagine revenge. You feel fear. You compare yourself to someone else. You want to quit something the moment it becomes uncomfortable. These reactions often arrive automatically. They are fast, primitive, emotional, and sometimes deeply irrational. But Stoicism draws an important distinction that modern people desperately need to hear. Your first thought is not your character. Your relationship with that thought is. There is a moment brief, almost invisible, between impulse and action. Most people never train that space. So they become immediate extensions of whatever emotion appears strongest in the moment. Anger speaks, and they obey. Fear speaks, and they retreat. Temptation speaks, and they surrender. But Marcus Aurelius practiced observing the mind without immediately kneeling to it. That is one of the foundations of mental strength. Not the absence of destructive thoughts, the refusal to automatically become them. Imagine a man driving home after a long day. Someone cuts him off in traffic. Instantly, the body reacts. Heat rises, the jaw tightens, the mind produces a sentence.
What an idiot, then another. People have no respect anymore.
Then another. I should teach him a lesson. Now pause there. That first flash of irritation may be automatic. But what happens next is where character begins. Most emotional damage happens because people continue feeding the reaction. Long after the initial spark, they rehearse the insult, expand the story, add emotional fuel, and by the time they arrive home, they are carrying anger from a stranger who has already forgotten the interaction entirely. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that the mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly entertains. So here is a practical tool that sounds almost too small to matter, but changes behavior dramatically when practiced consistently. Before responding emotionally, take 3 slow breaths, not as a performance, not as a spiritual ritual, as interruption. Because emotional momentum weakens when awareness enters the room. 3 breaths before sending the message. 3 breaths before defending yourself. 3 breaths before saying something designed to wound. You would be shocked how many regrets disappear inside those few seconds. And this is not weakness. Reaction is easy. Anyone can explode. Anyone can surrender to impulse. Anyone can become loud when emotions take over. But self-command requires awareness. The Stoics understood that freedom is not the ability to do whatever you feel. It is the ability to choose which feelings deserve action. That changes everything, because once you stop identifying with every passing mental impulse, you stop living as a prisoner of emotional weather. You become harder to provoke, harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize. And that matters today more than ever, because modern life is built to capture your attention before you even realize it is happening. Which leads directly into the next lesson. Most people are exhausted, not because life is too heavy, but because they keep giving their mind to things that never deserved it in the first place. There are people who have not spoken to you in years and still occupy space in your mind every day. An argument you replay in the shower. A comment you cannot forget. A person you keep mentally defending yourself against long after the moment has ended. And meanwhile, your actual life is happening in the background. Unattended. Marcus Aurelius understood something most people never fully realize. Attention is not a small thing. Attention is life itself. Whatever repeatedly occupies your mind begins shaping your emotional climate, your decisions, your habits, even the posture of your body. And today, more than ever, people are surrendering that attention carelessly. A stranger online ruins their mood. A comparison steals their motivation.
A notification interrupts their focus every 6 minutes.
Someone else's opinion becomes more important than their own conscience. Then they wonder why they feel mentally weak by the end of the day. But weakness is often not the absence of strength. It is the result of constant leakage. A mind pulled in every direction cannot become steady. Imagine a man sitting down to work on something meaningful. Within 10 minutes, he checks his phone, then email, then a video. Then another thought enters. Maybe I am falling behind now. His body is present, but his mind is scattered across 10 invisible conversations by evening. He feels exhausted, despite accomplishing almost nothing that truly mattered. This is why Marcus Aurelius repeatedly brought his mind back to what was essential. Not because distraction did not exist in his world, but because he understood that the quality of a life depends heavily on the quality of attention. And here is the deeper problem. Most people think peace comes from removing all disturbance. That will never happen. There will always be noise, always uncertainty, always difficult people, always temptation. The real skill is learning not to continue feeding disturbance after it appears. That is the turning point most people miss. You cannot stop every intrusive thought. You cannot prevent every irritation, but you can stop building a home for it inside your mind. Hear us, a practical exercise. Marcus Aurelius would probably appreciate if he lived today. At the end of the day, take 2 minutes and create what I call an attention ledger. Ask yourself, what consumed most of my mental energy today? And then ask the harder question, did it deserve that much of my life? Not your time, your life. Because attention is life measured in moments, you begin noticing uncomfortable truths quickly. How much energy disappears into imaginary arguments? How much peace is lost to comparison? How many hours are surrendered to stimulation that leaves nothing meaningful behind? And this realization can feel uncomfortable at first. Good. Stoicism was never designed to protect your illusions. It was designed to expose them. Marcus Aurelius knew that if a man cannot direct his attention intentionally, someone else eventually will. An algorithm, a crowd, an impulse, an insecurity, a fear. And once that happens, the mind no longer feels like a place of command. It feels like a place of constant invasion. So start smaller than your ego wants. You do not need to become perfectly disciplined overnight. You only need to begin reclaiming small pieces of authority. 1 uninterrupted hour, 1 meal without your phone, 1 walk without noise, 1 conversation where you are fully present. Because every time you reclaim attention voluntarily, you strengthen the part of yourself that can remain steady under pressure. And that brings us to something many people misunderstand completely. Discipline is not about becoming harsher toward yourself. At its best, discipline is protection. A lot of people secretly hate the word discipline because they associate it with punishment, restriction, pressure, a life with no joy, so they move between 2 extremes. Either they become rigid and burn themselves out, or they avoid structure completely and slowly lose respect for themselves. Marcus Aurelius approached discipline differently, not as cruelty toward the self, as protection of the self that changes the entire meaning. Because a disciplined life is not a smaller life, it is a less fragmented one. Look carefully at what destroys most people mentally. Not dramatic tragedy, small repeated abandonments, sleeping too little for months, consuming stimulation all day, saying yes to things they resent, eating in ways that make them foggy and tired, letting every impulse vote equally, postponing difficult conversations, avoiding silence, avoiding reflection, avoiding rest. At first, these choices feel harmless because they provide immediate comfort. But eventually, the bill arrives psychologically. The mind becomes noisy, the body becomes heavy, focus weakens, irritation increases, and underneath all of it, something even worse begins growing quietly. Self-distrust. Because every time you repeatedly betray what you know is necessary, part of you stops believing your own promises. That is why discipline matters. Not because perfection matters, because trust matters. Imagine 2 men waking up early. One does it to punish himself, because he thinks suffering automatically makes him superior. The other does it because he knows his mind is calmer when the morning begins intentionally. Outwardly, the action looks identical. Internally, they are living entirely different philosophies. One is driven by self-rejection, the other by self-respect. Real discipline says, I care enough about my future state that I will protect it now. Marcus Aurelius understood that freedom without self-command becomes chaos very quickly, and modern life offers endless opportunities to dissolve yourself slowly while calling it relaxation. A few more minutes scrolling, another distraction, another excuse, another night of postponing what matters. None of these feel dangerous in isolation, but repeated daily, they shape identity. This is why Stoicism focuses so heavily on small, consistent actions. because your life is rarely destroyed in one dramatic moment. It is usually negotiated away in tiny unconscious decisions. So here is a practical challenge for the next 24 hours. Choose one protective rule, not 10. 1. Something simple enough to keep honestly. Maybe, no phone for the first 30 minutes after waking, or I will sit in silence minutes before bed, or I will finish the task before seeking entertainment. The specific rule matters less than the meaning behind it. You are teaching yourself something extremely important. My impulses are not automatically in charge. That lesson creates stability, and stability creates confidence that is much deeper than motivation. Because motivation changes with mood. Discipline allows action even when mood disappears. And once you begin protecting your inner state intentionally, another realization emerges. Many of the things that destroy your peace were never unexpected. You simply never prepared yourself mentally to meet them calmly. Most people wake up expecting the day to obey them. They expect traffic to move smoothly, people to behave reasonably, plans to unfold correctly, technology to cooperate, their mood to remain stable. And when reality refuses this fantasy, they react as though life has violated some agreement. Marcus Aurelius trained himself differently. He prepared for difficulty before difficulty arrived. Not in a paranoid way, not by expecting disaster constantly, but by understanding something simple and powerful. A calm mind is rarely surprised by normal human reality. This is one of the most misunderstood Stoic practices. People hear about negative visualization and imagine pessimism, but the purpose was never despair. It was readiness. Marcus Aurelius would remind himself that people may be selfish, impatient, dishonest, distracted, arrogant, or emotional today, not because humanity is hopeless, because humanity is human. And once you stop expecting perfection from the world, irritation loses much of its power over you. Imagine two people stuck in the exact same situation. A delayed flight. One becomes furious immediately, complains to everyone, poisons his own nervous system for 3 straight hours. The other feels the inconvenience too. But internally, he already made room for the possibility that plans could break. So, instead of escalating emotionally, he adapts. Same event, different preparation, different suffering. This is one of the hidden forms of strength. Psychological flexibility. People who collapse emotionally from small disruptions are often not weak because life is uniquely cruel to them. They are weak because their minds never rehearsed reality honestly. They expected comfort as the default condition of existence. Marcus Aurelius knew better. He understood that inconvenience is not an interruption of life. It is part of life. That single realization removes enormous amounts of unnecessary anger. Here is a practical exercise you can begin tomorrow morning. Before checking your phone, before entering the noise, sit for 1 minute and quietly rehearse reality. Tell yourself, today may include delay, misunderstanding, disrespect, temptation, fatigue, unexpected problems, and moments where I will want to abandon my principles. Then add this, but none of these things can force me to lose command of myself. That final sentence matters, because Stoicism is not about controlling circumstances. It is about refusing to hand over your character every time circumstances become uncomfortable. And here is the strange paradox Marcus Aurelius discovered. When you stop demanding that life feel easy all the time, life actually becomes lighter. Not because problems disappear, because resistance decreases. You stop arguing with reality every 5 minutes. You stop acting shocked that people are imperfect. You stop expecting permanent emotional comfort from an unpredictable world. And that changes your energy completely. One of the reasons modern people feel constantly overwhelmed is that they are mentally unprepared for ordinary friction. Every inconvenience feels personal. Every obstacle feels offensive. Every uncomfortable emotion feels like evidence something is wrong. But often, nothing is wrong. You are simply experiencing the normal texture of being alive. And once you understand that, another uncomfortable truth appears. A large amount of emotional suffering does not come from being rejected. It comes from needing constant confirmation in the first place. There are people who appear successful on the outside, but internally their entire emotional stability depends on being noticed, praised, chosen, validated. They work hard, but secretly need applause to feel valuable. They help others but feel resentful when appreciation does not arrive. They post, speak, achieve, perform, and then quietly check the emotional mirror of other people's reactions to decide how they should feel about themselves. Marcus Aurelius saw this trap clearly. He understood how dangerous it becomes when your sense of worth depends on external approval. Because the moment your peace depends on praise, criticism gains the power to destroy you. And this happens in subtle ways every day. A man spends hours working on something meaningful, but one dismissive comment outweighs 50 positive outcomes. Someone walks into a room already measuring how they are being perceived. Another person changes their personality depending on who is present. This constant emotional dependence creates exhaustion because no crowd stays consistent. Public opinion shifts hourly. People project their own fears, moods, insecurities, and frustrations onto others all the time. If your identity depends on their reactions, your inner state will always remain unstable. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to a quieter standard. Not, was I admired, but was my action worthy? That is a radically different way to live. Because once the work itself becomes the focus, emotional freedom begins increasing immediately. Imagine two craftsmen building the same table. One constantly looks over his shoulder asking, "Do people think this is impressive?" The other focuses completely on precision, patience, and integrity in the work itself. The second man sleeps better, not because criticism never reaches him, but because his center of gravity is internal. And this is important. Stoicism does not ask you to become indifferent to all human connection. Respect matters, love matters. Recognition can feel meaningful. The danger begins when confirmation becomes psychological oxygen. Because then you stop acting from conviction. You start acting from emotional hunger. And emotional hunger makes people easy to manipulate, easy to flatter, easy to shame, easy to control. So here is a difficult question. Marcus Aurelius would probably force us to confront, honestly. How many of your decisions are actually yours? And how many are performances designed to secure approval? That question can expose entire patterns. The career chosen to impress others, the exhaustion created by saying yes too often, the constant need to appear composed, successful, desirable, or important. And underneath all of it, a quiet fear. If people stop validating me, what remains? What remains is the only thing Stoicism ever truly cared about. Character, the quality of your actions when applause disappears. So here is a practical shift you can apply immediately. The next time you finish something meaningful, resist the urge to instantly seek reaction. Pause. Ask yourself, even if nobody praised, would I still respect the effort? That question slowly rebuilds internal authority, because the strongest confidence is not loud. It is the ability to stand beside your own actions without needing constant external permission to feel worthy. And I want you to answer something, honestly, in the comments. Which has taken more of your peace recently? The need to be understood, the need to be liked, or the need to be validated? Don't choose the answer that sounds strongest. Choose the one that feels most true. Because once you begin loosening the addiction to approval, another emotion becomes easier to recognize clearly: anger. And most people completely misunderstand why anger can feel so powerful in the moment, even while quietly destroying them afterward. Anger is seductive because it creates the illusion of strength. Your body fills with energy. Your thoughts become sharp and absolute. For a brief moment, certainty replaces vulnerability, and that feeling can become addictive. Marcus Aurelius understood this danger deeply, not because he never felt anger, but because he saw what anger does to judgment. It narrows perception. It simplifies complexity. It convinces you that emotional intensity is the same thing as clarity. But very often, anger borrows energy from your future. You feel powerful for 5 minutes, then drained for 5 hours. A man explodes during an argument and spends the entire night replaying it. Someone sends the angry message that permanently changes a relationship. Another person humiliates someone publicly, wins the moment socially, and quietly loses self-respect afterward. This is why Stoicism treated anger carefully, not as proof of strength, as a force that easily turns intelligent people into temporary strangers to themselves. And notice something important. Most anger is not only about the present moment. It attaches itself to older wounds, accumulated resentment, exhaustion, humiliation, fear. The argument at dinner is often carrying stress from work. The outburst over something small is often fueled by months of silent frustration. That is why people sometimes react far beyond what the situation objectively deserves. The moment becomes symbolic. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself not to become contaminated by the behavior he disliked in others. That is difficult, because anger always tries to recruit you into imitation. Someone becomes disrespectful, so you justify cruelty. Someone lies, so you justify dishonesty. Someone loses control, so you permit yourself to lose control too. But then another person's behavior begins governing your character. And Stoicism refuses that surrender. Imagine a father arriving home after an exhausting day. His son spills a drink accidentally. Now there is a tiny moment where two futures exist. In one version, accumulated frustration erupts instantly. The room changes. Fear enters the atmosphere. The child remembers the reaction more than the mistake. In the other version, the father still feels irritation but pauses long enough not to weaponize it. Same emotion, different command. That difference shapes families, friendships, leadership, and self-respect over years. So here is one of the most practical Stoic rules you can apply immediately. When emotionally charged, delay the first sentence, not forever. Just long enough for the nervous system to stop demanding immediate discharge. Because once words leave your mouth, they begin creating consequences you cannot fully retrieve. And this does not mean suppressing everything. Stoicism is not emotional denial. It is emotional responsibility. There are moments where firmness is necessary. Boundaries matter. Truth matters. But clarity speaks differently than rage. A calm man can still be decisive, still direct, still powerful, without becoming destructive. Marcus Aurelius knew that every uncontrolled emotional reaction leaves residue inside the mind. The body remembers it. Relationships remember it. Your conscience remembers it. That is why self-command matters, not to appear superior, but to remain trustworthy to yourself under pressure. And strangely enough, one of the biggest reasons people stay trapped in cycles of anger and frustration is this. They keep waiting to feel ready before taking responsibility for their lives. But life changes the moment you stop waiting for perfect emotional conditions and simply do the next right thing anyway. A lot of people are trapped not by lack of intelligence, but by hesitation. They wait to feel motivated before acting. They wait to feel confident before speaking honestly. They wait to feel disciplined before changing habits. They wait to feel emotionally clear before making decisions. And meanwhile, months disappear. Sometimes years. Marcus Aurelius understood something uncomfortable but freeing. Action often creates clarity faster than overthinking ever will. Most people imagine transformation as a dramatic emotional moment, a breakthrough, a surge of inspiration, a sudden reinvention. But real change usually looks smaller than that, quieter, less cinematic. A man cleans the room he has ignored for weeks, makes the phone call he has been avoiding, goes for the walk even though he does not feel like it, opens the document, starts the workout, apologizes, turns the screen off earlier. None of these actions feel revolutionary in the moment, but they interrupt inertia. And inertia is one of the most dangerous psychological states a person can live in, because the longer you delay necessary action, the heavier the action begins to feel mentally. Eventually, people stop trusting their own intentions altogether. They become experts at planning and strangers to execution. Marcus Aurelius constantly brought himself back to duty, not in a cold or mechanical sense, in a grounding sense. What is the right thing to do now? Not next month. Not after perfect confidence arrives. Now, that question cuts through enormous amounts of emotional fog, because many people are secretly waiting for emotion to grant permission before they begin living properly. But emotions are unstable advisors. Some mornings you will feel focused. Some mornings you will feel tired. Some days you will feel hopeful. Other days uncertain. If action only happens when emotion cooperates, your life becomes fragile very quickly. Stoicism teaches something stronger. You can move while uncomfortable. You can act while uncertain. You can take one clean step forward without solving your entire future tonight. And that matters, because modern life encourages passive consumption constantly. People absorb motivation endlessly without converting it into behavior. They watch productivity videos while avoiding difficult work, read about discipline while remaining trapped in the same cycles. Think about changing more than they actually change. Marcus Aurelius would probably say, a philosophy that never enters behavior is decoration. So here is a practical exercise. Forget the perfect plan for a moment. Forget the fantasy version of yourself. Ask only this: what is the next right action available to me today? Not the biggest, not the most impressive. The next clean action. One honest email, one healthy meal, one difficult conversation, 1 hour of focused work, one promise kept. This approach matters psychologically because action restores agency, and agency restores energy. People often think they need energy first in order to act, but very often meaningful action is what creates energy in the first place. A man who sits frozen in avoidance becomes mentally heavier each day. A man who takes one honest step forward begins feeling movement return to his life, even if the problem is not fully solved yet. That distinction is critical, because Stoicism never promised control over outcomes, only responsibility over effort. And once you begin acting instead of endlessly negotiating with yourself, Another truth becomes impossible to ignore. A huge amount of modern suffering comes from worshipping comfort so consistently that discomfort begins to feel like danger. Comfort is not the enemy, but when comfort becomes the highest priority in your life, something inside you slowly weakens. Not immediately. That is what makes it dangerous. The decline is gradual, almost invisible at first. You avoid one difficult conversation. Then, another. You choose distraction instead of reflection, scrolling instead of silence, entertainment instead of effort, convenience instead of discipline. And, little by little, your tolerance for discomfort begins shrinking. Marcus Aurelius understood that a person who cannot voluntarily endure discomfort becomes extremely vulnerable to life, because life will eventually demand effort whether you are prepared or not. Loss will come, fatigue will come, conflict will come, uncertainty will come. And if your entire nervous system has been trained only for convenience, ordinary difficulty starts feeling unbearable. This is part of why so many people today feel mentally fragile. Not because they are incapable of strength, because they have unintentionally built lives where every discomfort is immediately anesthetized. The moment boredom appears, they reach for stimulation. The moment sadness appears, they seek escape. The moment stress appears, they numb it. Food, noise, scrolling, impulse purchases, endless consumption. None of these things are evil on their own. The danger is what happens when a person loses the ability to simply remain present without immediately soothing themselves. Marcus Aurelius practiced voluntary hardship, at times for this exact reason. Not to suffer unnecessarily. To remember that he could survive discomfort without collapsing psychologically. That is real confidence. Not believing life will always feel good, knowing you can remain steady even when it does. Imagine a man who says he wants focus, discipline, clarity, respect, strength, but sleeps with his phone beside his face every night, consumes noise constantly, avoids difficult tasks until panic forces action, and never practices saying no to himself. His problem is not lack of desire. His nervous system has simply become over-conditioned to comfort and immediate relief. And the more immediate relief dominates your life, the harder meaningful effort begins to feel. This is why Stoicism values voluntary discomfort. Small acts of chosen difficulty rebuild psychological resilience. Cold air on the morning walk. Finishing the workout when the mood disappears. Sitting with silence instead of instantly escaping it. Telling the truth even when it creates tension. These moments train something deeper than discipline. They train self-respect. Because every time you willingly endure manageable discomfort, you send yourself a message. I am capable of remaining stable, even when life stops feeling pleasant. That changes how you carry yourself, how you think, how you respond under pressure. So here is a challenge for the next 24 hours. Choose one form of voluntary discomfort. Something safe, simple, intentional. Maybe you wake up earlier than usual. Maybe you take a walk without music. Maybe you eat one meal without stimulation. Maybe you finally handle the conversation you keep postponing. The goal is not suffering. The goal is remembering that discomfort is not an emergency. Because once discomfort stops controlling your decisions, your life expands again. And strangely enough, one of the biggest reasons people cling so tightly to comfort is because they live as though time is endless, as though there will always be another chance to become who they know they could be. Marcus Aurelius warned himself against that illusion constantly. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on death, not because he was obsessed with darkness, Because he was obsessed with clarity. He understood something most people spend years trying not to think about. Time is not slowly arriving, it is slowly leaving. And once you truly feel that, not intellectually, but emotionally, many of your excuses begin losing their power. The unnecessary arguments, the endless postponing, the habits that quietly drain your life, the relationships sustained only by avoidance, the days consumed entirely by distraction. Death, in Stoicism, was never meant to create despair. It was meant to create precision. Imagine two men waking up on the same morning. One lives as though life will repeat forever. The other remembers, even briefly, that his time is limited. They move through the day differently. One delays what matters. The other speaks more honestly. One wastes hours numbing himself. The other becomes more intentional with attention. One assumes there will always be another opportunity. The other understands the danger of permanent postponement. Marcus Aurelius used mortality almost like a lens, a way to separate what is essential from what is noise. Because when you remember that your life is finite, many things suddenly reveal their true size. Some problems shrink immediately. Some priorities become embarrassingly shallow. Some fears lose authority. And some truths become impossible to avoid any longer. This is why one of the most powerful Stoic questions is also one of the simplest. If I continue living exactly like this, where does this path lead? Not dramatically. Honestly, because many people already know the answer. They know which habits are eroding them. They know which distractions are stealing years. They know which conversations need to happen. They know where they have been lying to themselves. But they live as though there will always be more time to correct it later. Marcus Aurelius challenged that illusion constantly inside his own mind. Not to create anxiety, to create wakefulness. Because mortality does something strange to the human mind when faced honestly. It exposes triviality. Suddenly, proving yourself to strangers feels less important. Endless comparison feels absurd. Petty resentment feels heavy and wasteful. You begin asking a better question. What actually deserves the limited hours of my life? That question changes behavior. A man spends more time with his child instead of endlessly refreshing his phone. Someone finally starts the work they keep postponing out of fear. Another person stops wasting years waiting for universal approval before becoming themselves honestly. This is the deeper purpose of Stoic reflection on death. Not fear of dying, fear of never fully living while alive. And there is another uncomfortable truth hidden here. Many people are not exhausted because life is impossible. They are exhausted because they keep betraying what they know matters most. That internal conflict drains enormous amounts of energy. Marcus Aurelius understood that peace does not come from pretending death is distant. Peace comes from aligning your actions with what you would still respect if your time were limited. So tonight, ask yourself something without distraction. If this year was not guaranteed to repeat, what would you stop pretending is harmless? That question can change an entire direction of life if answered honestly. Because once you stop treating time casually, another transformation becomes possible. You stop needing dramatic declarations to prove your strength, and you begin understanding that real power often looks much quieter than people expect. A lot of people think boundaries are loud, aggressive, confrontational. They imagine strength as dramatic speeches, emotional ultimatums, or cutting people off with theatrical intensity. But Marcus Aurelius understood something quieter. The strongest boundary is often the one that does not need performance. It simply remains consistent. Most resentment grows where honesty was abandoned. A man says yes when he means no, agrees to things that violate his priorities, keeps answering messages that drain him, keeps tolerating behavior he secretly knows is unhealthy. Then eventually he explodes, not because the final moment was unbearable, but because he ignored his own limits for too long. This is one of the hidden costs of people-pleasing. You slowly disappear from your own life, and at first it can even look virtuous, helpful, flexible, available. But underneath, exhaustion grows, because every unnecessary agreement carries a psychological weight afterward. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the importance of inner alignment, not living divided against yourself. That means your actions, your values, and your words begin matching more consistently. And boundaries are part of that integrity, not walls against humanity, filters against self-betrayal. Imagine someone constantly asking for your time while giving little respect in return. Most people respond in one of two unhealthy ways, either silent resentment or emotional overreaction. But Stoicism points towards something steadier. Calm clarity, no unnecessary hostility, no dramatic explanation, just truth. I can commit to that. I need to focus on what I already chose. That does work for me. Simple sentences, clean decisions, no performance required. Because the more secure a person becomes internally, the less they need emotional theater to defend themselves. And this matters deeply, because every weak boundary trains the mind to believe your priorities are negotiable under pressure. Eventually, even you stop taking your own commitments seriously. That is why boundaries are not only social tools, they are psychological training. They teach your mind. What matters to me will not be abandoned every time discomfort appears. And yes, some people will dislike your boundaries. That is unavoidable. Marcus Aurelius knew that trying to be approved by everyone creates internal chaos very quickly. If you constantly reshape yourself to avoid disappointing others, you eventually lose any stable center inside yourself. And then something dangerous happens. You begin living reactively instead of intentionally, always adjusting, always accommodating, always emotionally available to outside pressure. But a calm mind needs protected space, time to think, time to recover, time to choose consciously instead of reacting automatically. So here is something practical to try immediately. The next time you feel the impulse to explain yourself excessively, pause. Give the shorter, honest answer instead. Not cold, not defensive, just clear. Because mature strength does not beg for permission to exist. And once you begin protecting your energy more intentionally, another realization emerges. The real battle is not controlling other people. It is learning how to govern the part of yourself that keeps abandoning peace from within. Marcus Aurelius used a phrase repeatedly in his private reflections. He spoke about protecting what he called the ruling center, the inner place where judgment is formed, where decisions are made, where character either strengthens or slowly dissolves. Today, most people live far away from that center. Their mind is constantly occupied, but rarely examined. They know what everyone else is doing, what everyone else believes, what everyone else posted. But they have lost contact with their own interior life. And this creates a strange kind of emptiness, because a person can be endlessly stimulated while remaining deeply disconnected from himself. Marcus Aurelius understood that the mind cannot remain clear if it is never cleaned. Just like a room abandoned for months eventually fills with dust, the inner life fills with resentment, noise, envy, fear, fantasy, impulse, and confusion when left unattended. That is why self-examination mattered so much in Stoicism, not self-obsession. Self-honesty. There is a huge difference. Self-obsession keeps staring at the ego. Self-honesty quietly asks, where did I lose command of myself today? That question requires courage because it removes excuses. Imagine a man who spends the entire day irritated. Traffic irritated him. Messages irritated him. Work irritated him. By nighttime, he tells himself the world is the problem. But if he pauses honestly, another possibility appears. Maybe exhaustion was speaking through him. Maybe unprocessed frustration was leaking into every interaction. Maybe his mind has become so overstimulated that silence itself now feels uncomfortable. This is the kind of awareness Marcus Aurelius practiced constantly, not to become perfect, but to remain awake. Because people who never examine themselves tend to repeat the same emotional cycles for years while blaming circumstances endlessly. And one of the most dangerous things a human being can lose is the ability to observe himself truthfully. Without that ability, patterns become identity. Anger becomes just who I am. Distraction becomes normal. Avoidance becomes personality. But the moment awareness returns, change becomes possible again. So here is a practical Stoic practice you can begin tonight. Before sleeping, sit quietly for 5 minutes. No phone, no noise, and review the day honestly. Ask yourself, where did I remain steady? Where did I abandon myself? What triggered me? What drained my energy unnecessarily? What would have made today more aligned with the person I want to become? Do not answer like a lawyer defending yourself. Answer like a man trying to become trustworthy. That distinction changes everything. Because the goal is not guilt. Guilt without correction becomes emotional vanity. The goal is adjustment. Marcus Aurelius understood that self-command is built through repeated correction, not through perfection. A ship stays on course, not because it never drifts, but because it keeps recalibrating. The same is true for your mind. And once you begin cleaning your inner life consistently, another transformation happens quietly. You stop measuring yourself mainly by appearance, status, or mood, and you begin asking a deeper question. Can my own conscience stand comfortably beside the way I am living? There are people who look successful in public, but avoid being alone with themselves in private. And there are others who may never impress the crowd, yet sleep with a quieter kind of strength, because their conscience is not constantly fighting their behavior. Marcus Aurelius cared deeply about this distinction. Not image, not performance. Integrity. The ability to remain internally aligned even when nobody is watching. Because eventually, every human being lives with two reputations, the one other people have of them and the one they quietly hold inside themselves. The second one matters more than most people admit. A man can receive praise all day and still feel hollow if he knows his life is built on avoidance, dishonesty, cowardice, or constant self-betrayal. And another man may struggle, fail, rebuild, and remain imperfect yet still carry dignity because he knows he is facing life honestly. This is one of the deepest Stoic ideas. Peace is difficult when your conscience keeps collecting evidence against you. Every broken promise to yourself leaves residue. Every hidden lie, every act of cowardice you justify repeatedly. Every moment where you know the right thing and consistently move away from it. At first, these choices seem small, but over time they shape identity. Marcus Aurelius understood that character is not built mainly during dramatic moments. It is built through repeated private decisions. A man says he values health, but keeps abandoning his body. Says he values truth, but constantly avoids difficult honesty. Says he values presence, but lives mentally absent every day. Eventually, the contradiction becomes exhausting, because human beings are not designed to live divided against themselves forever. This is why Stoicism places so much emphasis on conduct, not moral superiority. Internal coherence. Imagine a craftsman working alone late at night. Nobody will see the details he is correcting. Nobody would criticize him if he ignored them. But he fixes them anyway. Why? Because his standard is no longer dependent on visibility. That is, integrity. And Marcus Aurelius believed that this kind of private discipline creates a deeper form of confidence than public approval ever can, because external praise can disappear instantly. But self-respect compounds quietly over years. So here is a practical challenge. Choose one private standard. 1. Not for performance. Not to post online. Not to impress anyone. Something only you will fully know. Maybe you stop lying in small ways. Maybe you keep your morning promise consistently. Maybe you stop consuming something that weakens your clarity. Maybe you become fully present during conversations instead of half listening while distracted. Small actions, repeated honestly. That is how identity changes. Not through fantasy, through evidence. Marcus Aurelius never promised that life would become painless. He knew better than that. People will still disappoint you. You will still feel fear sometimes. You will still become tired, uncertain, emotional, distracted. But if your conscience can remain beside you peacefully through those moments, something powerful begins forming internally. A kind of calm that does not depend entirely on circumstances anymore. And when all 13 of these lessons begin working together, you realize something extraordinary. Mental strength is not built in one dramatic transformation. It is built response by response, decision by decision, day by day. Marcus Aurelius did not become mentally strong because he escaped difficulty. He became mentally strong because he stopped expecting life to remove difficulty before he allowed himself to become steady. That is the thread connecting every lesson in this video. Not control over the world, control over participation. You cannot stop people from being disrespectful. You cannot prevent uncertainty from entering your life. You cannot remove temptation, distraction, disappointment, aging, loss, or emotional pain from the human experience. But you can decide what gains authority inside your mind. That is the inner citadel Stoicism speaks about. Not a wall separating you from life, a stable center within life. And it is built in quieter ways than most people imagine. When you pause before reacting, when you separate facts from interpretation, when you stop feeding unnecessary anger, when you reclaim attention from noise, when you keep a promise. Nobody else would have noticed if you broke. When you choose truth over performance, when you endure discomfort without immediately escaping it, when you act before you feel perfectly ready, when you stop negotiating with habits that are weakening your future, when you remember your time is finite and begin living with greater precision. These moments seem small individually, but repeated consistently, they alter the architecture of a human being. Marcus Aurelius understood that character is not built through intensity alone. It is built through repetition, daily correction, daily awareness, daily return. A calm man is not calm because nothing affects him. He is calm because he has trained himself not to surrender instantly to everything that affects him. That is a very different kind of strength. And maybe the most important realization of all is this: Stoicism is not about becoming less human. It is about becoming harder to pull away from what is best in you, because the goal was never emotional numbness. The goal was freedom. Freedom from compulsive reaction. Freedom from constant inner chaos. Freedom from the endless emotional slavery of needing every moment to feel comfortable before you can remain grounded. And once a person begins developing that kind of inner authority, something changes quietly in the way they move through the world. Less noise, less desperation, less performance. More clarity, more intention, more dignity, more peace that does not need to announce itself loudly. And that brings us back to where this video began. To the ordinary morning where most people lose themselves before the day even starts. Tomorrow morning, the world will probably look almost exactly the same. Your phone will still light up. People will still disappoint you sometimes. There will still be pressure, noise, temptation, uncertainty, responsibilities waiting for you before you feel fully ready. Marcus Aurelius knew this. Stoicism was never meant to create an imaginary life where nothing difficult happens. It was meant to help a human being remain whole while difficulty happens. And maybe that is the real shift, not becoming invincible, becoming less available to chaos. Think back to the man from the beginning of this video, the one waking up already tense, already mentally scattered before the day even began. At first, he believed peace would come, when the world finally became easier, when people changed, when stress disappeared, when emotions settled permanently. But slowly he discovers something else. Peace begins the moment he stops handing himself away automatically. One reaction at a time, one interruption at a time, one honest correction at a time. He pauses before answering. He notices the story forming inside his mind before believing it completely. He stops feeding every irritation, stops chasing validation from people who cannot define his worth anyway. Stops escaping discomfort every time life becomes demanding. Stops treating his attention like something cheap. And little by little, a different kind of strength begins forming. Not loud strength, not performative strength. Quiet strength, the kind that remains steady in ordinary moments. Because in the end, your life is not built mainly from dramatic turning points. It is built from repeated daily responses. The tone of your voice when stressed. The decision you make when nobody is watching. The thought you refuse to keep feeding. The promise you finally keep. The moment you choose presence instead of escape. That is where character lives. And this is important to remember. You do not need to master all 13 lessons tonight. Marcus Aurelius himself wrote these reflections as reminders, because he understood that staying centered is a continuous practice, not a permanent achievement. You will still fail sometimes. You will still react emotionally. You will still drift. So will everyone else. The difference is whether you return consciously or continue drifting unconsciously for years. That choice changes everything. So before you leave this video, I want you to make one decision. Not 10-1. One adjustment you will make in the next 24 hours that your future self would respect. Maybe it is a boundary. Maybe it is a conversation. Maybe it is putting the phone down earlier tonight. Maybe it is finally beginning something you keep postponing. Whatever it is, write it in the comments. Make it real. And if this video gave language to something you have been feeling quietly for a long time, subscribe and continue this journey with us. Not because watching videos alone changes a life, but because reminders matter. Especially in a world constantly trying to pull your mind away from itself. Marcus Aurelius once spent his nights reminding himself how to remain steady in a chaotic world. Now it becomes your turn to practice it. Calmly, quietly, one day at a time.